Hello everyone. Welcome to Cloud World. My name is Santiago. So in today's video, we are going to be doing a hands-on on Event Hub. So in the last video, we saw all the basics that you need to know in order to understand the most basic concepts that are tied to the Azure Event Hub. So we covered what is an MS space, what is an Event Hub itself, what is a consumer group, and we spoke a little bit about of the different examples that you can use Event Hub in your real world application. We also spoke a little bit about the integration that you can do and what are the most common use cases for the industry for tools like Event Hub. And we also mentioned that we can use different protocols in order to use the Event Hub services. So for today's video, we will do in a more hands-on. We are going to explore on the Azure CLI how to create those resources from scratch. And also we are going to be doing a quick demo for a consumer and a producer that is going to be written using the SDK. And that code is going to be sending messages and also consuming those from the Event Hub. In the future videos, we will be doing a video using Kafka protocol as well, so you can explore the different options that you have in order to consume and produce messages for Event Hub. So with that in hand, let's get started. Well, the first thing that we need to set up, it will be as usual our resource group, our location, the namespace name and the Event Hub name and the consumer group and the identity that we would like to use. So starting this video, we will be using PowerShell scripts to summarize everything and make it pretty simple. You will be also to find all these queries into the repository itself so you can execute them pretty easily. Feel free to modify the resource group and the other variables that you need to. And also you can provide us those as an input from the PowerShell in case that you want to leave the default values. So if you have been following on the past videos, we usually use managed identity and also role-based access control in order to access the Azure resources. In today's video, there is not going to be any difference on that. We are not going to be using any keys or anything like that to connect to the Event Hub. So as always, we will be using a managed identity in order to provide the proper permission that are required to access with the Event Hub. Please keep in mind, if you don't have a managed identity created so far, use the AC identity create command in order to create one. In our case, since we already have one created from the previous videos, we are going to be using the first command in order to retrieve our managed identity. Once we have our managed identity, the first step that we need to complete in order to be able to use Event Hub is to create the namespace. So for that, we will be using the AC and the Event Hub's tooling, and in this one we are going to be working with the namespace and we are going to be using the create operation. We will provide as usual the resource group, the name of the resource itself and the location that we would like to create our resource to. As always, we have different SKUs. We spoke about those in the previous video, but the most common ones will be the standard and the premium one. So for today we will be using the standard one. We are going to enable the auto-inflate. This is for the scalability itself. But in our case, just as an example, we are going to be using a maximum throughput of 1 unit. Remember that you could have even up to 40 units in the standard tier. Since we are already creating the resource, we are going to be taking advantage of that in order to assign directly the managed identity. So this is why we retrieve initially the managed identity to be able to assign it in here. Keep in mind that for this first step, we need the ID of the managed identity itself, so that's what we need to retrieve. From there, we are only going to be querying the output of the body just to display that the resource has been created properly. Now that we have our namespace created, the next step is to set up the Event Hub. So the Event Hub follows the same pattern. We have the Event Hub object. In this case, we are going to be working with Event Hub itself, and we are going to be creating that resource. So as always, we provide the resource group. We need to specify the namespace that is going to contain this Event Hub, and we also need to provide a proper name for our Event Hub. Here also we provide a cleanup policy. If you remember, we spoke about the partitions, and the partition is like a log if you would like to see it that way, and that partition log is going to keep the historic of your messages from the past and the future and the present when you are getting any messages. So the cleanup policy delete, as we spoke on the previous video, what it does is after some time it deletes part of the log and only keeps like the last 1 hour in the default value, but you can set up that as you need to. We are going to only be creating one partition by default, and that will be everything. Once this part of the command has been executed, you will have your namespace and your Event Hub ready to go. Now that you have your Event Hub created, what you need to do is to create the consumer group. So for that, we need to query the ID of the Event Hub that we just created. So we are going to be using the namespace show option in order to retrieve it. You could have done this also in here in the namespace and just store the ID, but I wanted to show you that the usual list and show operation are also available for namespaces too. So we retrieve the ID of the object, just querying it directly, providing the resource group and the name of the namespace itself, and that is going to be stored in this variable. Now the last step will be to create the consumer group. Once more, we are going to be using the Event Hub's object inside the Event Hub and the consumer group of creation operation. So we need to provide a name for our consumer group, a name for the Event Hub that is going to be attached to this consumer group, and also the namespace. So you need to provide the three: the name of the resource group, the Event Hub, and the Event Hub namespace itself. And as always, you need to provide the resource group, and that will be everything. So now you have everything set up for the Event Hub perspective. So what we need to do is to use the manage identity in order to set up the proper role permission when we deploy this application into the Azure portal. So for that, we need to retrieve from the manage identity the principal ID. So we do once more the identity show command. We provide the name of the identity, the resource group, and we ask the query to return only the principal ID. This is all we need to. With that, we can go on and create the role assignment for it. Once more, using the AC role assignment create, we specify the object ID is our manage identity. The assigned type, as always, is a service principal, but remember this is a managed identity, just described as a service principal in this command in this case. And the role that we would like to provide to our managed identity will be the Azure Event Hub's data owner. This role is going to allow our application to not only send messages to the Event Hub, but also consume those. It contains both permissions at the same time. The scope, of course, is going to be our Event Hub, and we are only going to be querying the created on just to make sure everything has been created successfully. So in order to save time, I already executed this query. So if we go back into the Azure portal, we will see that we have everything created. We have our namespace created, we have the Event Hub created, and also our consumer group here created. I am using the Dapper Hub name in this case because this Event Hub is going to be very handy in an incoming series of videos that we are going to be working with Dapper, which is a very exciting tool to create event-driven applications using Azure Container Apps. Okay, now let's take a look into the code. Now from the previous videos, we already used the Azure tooling in order to create resources and access those directly into the code. But let's make a quick refresher. So all you need to do in order to be able to inject several Azure services is to include the Azure.identity package in order to make sure that your application can authenticate using your local account or a managed identity when you are deploying the application into the Azure side. From there, you will need the Microsoft.extension.azure in order to be able to inject Azure Client into your code. From here, you will need to install the NuGet package for the Event Hubs, which is going to allow you to inject an Event Hub using only the namespace. If we take a sneak peek into the app settings, we only need to provide two things for the producer in this case: the namespace and also the Event Hub name. We don't need to do anything else. With that in hand, we can inject a producer client using the namespace and the Event Hub. We just give a name as usual, and we are saying that we are going to be using the default Azure credential, so that means the code is going to be identifying by itself the best option to authenticate against the Azure resources. If we take a sneak peek into the implementation of how to send messages into the Event Hub, it's actually pretty simple. As always, we inject the Azure Client Factory, and in this case we are interested in using the Event Hub producer client in order to access our client. Using the factory, we create the client based on the configuration that we just saw a moment ago. And here it comes the important part. In order to send a message to the event grid, you can provide a batch of events as an enumerable, or you can provide an event batch as a special object that is defined into the Azure library. In this case, that is the event.batch. So all you need to do when you create the event batch data is just to provide the creation of the batch async, and you can provide the partition ID that you would like to send that message in here. We are going to be sending that value as part of the request. And using the batch object, you can use the try that method in order to include a new message. So as part of the request that is coming into this media TR handler, we have a message request that looks pretty simple. It only contains a message, a messenger, the hour or the timestamp where the message has been sent, and the partition ID. So from the API that we are going to be exploring in a moment, we are going to be sending those messages. So from here on the MN batch, what we need to do is use the tried method and use a MN data in order to encode our message as a default message from the Event Hub. So as you can see, this makes things pretty simple. From there, if the add is successful, you will be able to use the method sendAsync in order to send those messages into the Event Hub. So as you can see, there is nothing overcomplicated into the code in order just to send messages into the Event Hub. If we take a look into the consumer, there are no major difference into the implementation. The only thing that you will notice is that not only you need to provide as part of the configuration the namespace and the Event Hub, but you also need to provide the consumer group that is going to be attached into this application directly. In this case, we will be using the consumer group. In this case, is the VG job in order to connect to our application on the Azure side. So with that in hand, we only need to connect into the factory once more using the same instance, but in this case we are changing the Event Hub into a consumer client, not a producer client. That is the major difference. We create the client in here, we specify the partition that we would like to connect to, and we just loop into the background job in order to access any messages that arrive into this partition. As you can see, we spoke about the event position that we would like to grab our messages, so we can go into the earliest, which is going to go into the most early position into the partition, or the log, or the latest one, which is the most recent one. Also, you will have the capability to move into the past using an offset, an in-queue time, and a sequence number based on the requirements that you would like to move on your partition. For today's video, we will be using the latest configuration just to get the latest messages that are arriving into this partition. And from here, we are only printing the message into the console, nothing too fancy, so we can take a sneak peek when the message arrives. Okay, so let's execute this code and do some testing. Okay, now that we have our API and background jobs being executed successfully, we have our API as a producer and a consumer as a background job. And what we are going to do is go back into the browser, and we are going to be sending this sample message. We have the message hello from CloudWorld, the messenger is Santiago. We are going to be leaving the date as default, and we are going to be sending the message to the partition number 0. Remember, the partition ID is going to be 0 base index, so if you have two partitions, you are going to have partition 0 and number 1. Remember, the name of the partition ID is that integer or value, but it's treated as a string. So keep that in mind when working with your application. So okay, so let's send this message very quickly. We had a successful response from the request. So if we go into the IDE, we will be able to see that the producer sent successfully the message into the Dapper Hub, into the partition ID 0 in this case. Remember that the producer doesn't take a difference between the partitions itself, so he's had the capability to send the message to all the partitions that match the criteria that is defined in the Event Hub. So since we already have only one partition, that is everything that is going to happen in this case. We take a sneak peek into the consumer, we see that the message also arrived. We have the message from partition number 0 and the message hello CloudWorld. The consumer group is going to be background job, and the partition ID is going to be 0 as well. So let's send another message into the browser. I'm going to go into the browser and I'm going to make a quick modification to the message itself. So take a look into the consumer after I make the execution. So I just send the message. It should not take too long before the message arrives into the CLI2. So we already got our message in here. So we have the modification and the new message arrive. So as you can see, this is almost like a real-time communication. You send a message and it doesn't take too long until the consumers take those messages. Okay, so in today's video, we learned how to create a Event Hub from scratch, namespace, Event Hub itself, and the consumer group using the Azure CLI. And we also did a sneak peek and a quick dive into the producer and consumer code into the .NET side. Join me on the next video when we are going to start working with Dapper, initially locally, and then we are going to be deploying applications into the Azure Container App using Dapper. Dapper is a framework that allow us to work with our event-driven application. So we are going to have a lot of fun with that framework, and we are going to be using tools like Event Hub and Cosmos DB, another tool, in order to make flawless integration. So thank you for joining me in today's video. See you in the next one.